Welcome to YouTube channel Knowledge Base. This is Suresh Venkat, connecting world with innovative experts. Let's welcome Sabapathy Narayanan, founder Stickytales. He has done his MTech in Environmental Science and Engineering from IIT Bombay, passed out in 1998. He has a passion towards storytelling. For past 10 years, he has done purpose-driven stories for organizations and created sales and PR worthy stories. Till today, he has crafted close to around 750 purpose-driven stories, and he has done 50 workshops till today. Today, Mr. Sabapathy Narayanan is going to talk on business storytelling. Over to you, sir. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Suresh. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here, Suresh.
Yeah.
So two CEOs set out into the woods on a weekend getaway, and they spot a grizzly bear at a distance. One of these CEOs coolly pulls up his sneakers from his backpack and starts to put them on. The other CEO looks at him and says, "What are you doing? You must be nuts. You can't really outrun a grizzly bear." To which the first CEO quietly responds, "I know for sure that I can't outrun a grizzly bear, but I sure as hell can outrun you." Does this anecdote make you understand what competitive advantage is? Would you remember this a day from now, a week from now, a month from now, or a year from now? Would you be able to retell this without losing its essence? So can you understand, can you remember, and can you retell? Or is what Dan and Chip Heath in their book Made to Stick call as the test of three when it comes to communications being sticky? So how do you make your communication sticky, and what's the easiest way by which you can make something that is understandable, rememberable, and retellable? It is in the form of a story. So stories are the ones that which make people understand what the speaker is trying to convey to the audience. And that's the one that make people remember, because we still remember all the stories that we have heard from our grandparents and parents and what we read in the books and all that. Okay. So, but we don't remember the math and science that which we have learned in school, however. Okay. So that's what makes it story very, very, very powerful. So many a times when I consult companies or when I do corporate storytelling workshops and all that, people ask me, there are situations where I'm not able to come up with a story, because it is very acceptable, because you can't storify all of your communication. Stories have a place, but however, you can't storify everything and anything that's under the sun. So what do you do in such a situation? So that's the reason why, typically when you call a stories, a lot of artistic people would say that you'll have to transport your audience to where the story is happening. But in the case of corporate storytelling or business storytelling, what you are trying to do is you have an objective before you create your story. So it has to have a purpose. You have to make that point for which you are doing the story. So you'll have to drive home that point. So when you look at a structure of a story, so what you typically do in a normal story structure is you set the scene, you introduce the characters, you encounter the obstacle, you overcome the obstacle, you resolve the story, right? So that's what is a typical structure of a story. But when it comes to corporate storytelling, in addition, you also go and make the point and then ask the question and you restate that point. So that's what brings in that objectivity into your business storytelling. So when you tell business stories, you have to be very, very conscious of the fact that it should be done within 2 to 3 minutes time. Okay. If it exceeds beyond that, then people may lose interest. People may not take you seriously. So the crisper it is, the better it would be for your message to be sent across to the audience. So that's where the business storytelling aspects comes into play. So if you have to define what is storytelling, what is a story, people will typically say it's a sequence of events with a conflict in it. So without conflict, there's no story. Without a challenge, without an issue, without a villain, there's no story, right? So, but when it comes to corporate storytelling, you are actually taking a fact and then you are telling that fact wrapped in context in an emotional way. So that's what makes it corporate storytelling. So it's not just going to be a sequence of events. Instead, you need to have the context. So for instance, if you're going to talk about a tree, you're not going to talk directly about a tree. Instead, you're going to give the context of a forest before you actually get into the trees. So that's what makes it a story, right? So I was just saying that, most often than not, you will find it difficult in a lot of situations to storyfy your communication. So that's the reason why when I define corporate storytelling, for me, an example is a story, an anecdote is a story, a metaphor is a story, an analogy is a story, okay? And a story in its original form is also a story. So that's how I look at it in a corporate setting, because for instance, I'll give you an example. When my son was about 6 years old, one of his friends had come home for a sleepover, right? So, and they were having dinner that night. And while having dinner, this friend of my son asked him, "So what are you planning to do after dinner?" And he said, "I'm going to read Tom Sawyer." The other kid did not know what Tom Sawyer was. Okay, so he asked, "So what is Tom Sawyer?" And his immediate response was, "It's a pictureless book." And both of them understood what was being communicated because they knew the context in which they were talking. So that actually reminded me, and I started thinking. So when automobiles were invented, okay, people did not know how to define an automobile. And whatever definitions that they came up with, people did not understand those definitions. So that's when they decided, okay, so how do I communicate what an automobile is to an audience? So what is it that the audience already know? They know carriages pulled by horses. So what is an automobile? An automobile is a carriage which is not pulled by a horse. So that's how they defined an automobile, as a horseless carriage. So now you know what it is, you know certain things, and now you can define based on what it is not. So it's an analogy that they had taken and then defined an automobile. So that again is a fantastic form of communication, right? So I even call that as a story. Okay, while a lot of people may not agree with my definition, but it allows me to communicate what I'm trying to communicate. So that storyfies the communication for me. And then plus, many times you have to be careful about the definition of a story itself. Okay, so I actually performed in an open mic session at Igmore. Okay, so where I went and told them a story about, I think in 2011 or 2012, India played a match against Australia at Chepauk Stadium, where Sachin was batting. So I, along with a friend of mine who's a professional cricketer, we wanted to catch the second day of the test match. So we took a train from Kodambakam to Chepauk station. Okay, so inside the train, we met with an Australian. So he was asking, how do I reach the stadium? Would tickets be available and all that? So we said, why don't you come along? We are also going there. Okay, so he tagged along with us. And by the time we reached Chepauk station, we realized that he was carrying a bottle of water. And we told him they don't allow water bottles inside as a security measure to prevent people from throwing it onto the ground. So he immediately looked at it and then he threw the bottle on the sides of the station. So this friend of mine who was with me, he asked him, would you do that in Australia? So that guy did not know what to answer. He felt so uncomfortable about having thrown that water bottle, and he was about to go and pick it up. So that's when this friend of mine again said, even we wouldn't do that in Australia. Okay, so that kind of eased the tension there. And I told this as a story in an open mic. And at the end of the session, one of these professional storytellers came to me and said, she did not hear a story. There was no telling. There was no plot. There was no theme. I did not define who that Australian is. I did not define the world of that Australian in India. Okay, so she said, if I have to make that anecdote into a story, I'll have to start right from the beginning, all over. Okay, so was I surprised by what she said? I am not. I was not. Okay. So did I take that advice? No, I don't think I would even today, because you have to be very, very careful about the well-told story in a corporate setting. So you don't have to really define the world of an Australian. You don't have to transport your audience to where the story is happening in a corporate setting. So the main purpose of a story in a corporate setting is the moment you tell a story, they should be able to think of similar stories that have happened in their lives or in their organizations. The moment you do that, then you are successful as a storyteller. So I always tell people to draw from their own personal experiences and create stories. Okay, so in a business story, you can't do made up stories, right? So the stories will have to be authentic. Stories should have happened to you or should have happened to your organization, or whatever that which you do, it has to be true. Otherwise, it loses its significance. So I always tell people to come up with their own personal stories in a business setting. Okay. So many people ask, why would somebody be interested in my personal story? Okay. I'm not that interesting a person. So why would somebody be interested in my story? So I always ask such people, I mean, who do they get inspired by? Okay, so who inspires them the most, or who has inspired them the most? So most of them come up with names like Mahatma Gandhi, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and all of it. But do you really think that you can achieve the kind of stardom that any of these people have achieved? So you've already put them on a pedestal. It's very, very difficult for you to reach where they have reached. So people don't relate themselves to these figures, right? So they have already put them on a pedestal. But whereas when you tell your story, it is very, very relatable. It shows you how vulnerable you are. It shows what all things that which you have done as an individual. It becomes very, very relatable for your audience. They would be able to identify themselves with what you are as an individual, what you have brought to the table as an individual. So that's where your personal stories really, really work very well in a business setting. So I typically have a template to create these personal stories. So I talk about where do you come from, where are you currently, and where do you intend to go. Okay, and each one of us will have at least 50 to 100 stories from our past lives, right? But not all those stories will fit into this template of where do you come from, where you are currently, and where do you want to go. So anything that cuts across as a straight line between these 3 points, I take that out as a story, and then I use it in different contexts. So normally, I mean, out of these 40, 50 stories that each one of us have, or 50 to 100 stories that each one of us have, probably about half a dozen stories will fit into this template of where do you come from, where you are currently, and where you want to go later. Okay, so as long as it fits in, that would be a fantastic story for you to use in a business context. So identify those aspects from your lives and then create them into stories. I typically practice every story before I tell them to the outside world at least 40 times. Okay, so before I actually take it to the outside world. So it makes a lot of sense for you to practice. And at the same time, what happens is every time you tell a story, right? Even if it is the same audience who's listening to the story, their perspectives towards that story really changes. The way in which they absorb that story, the way in which they listen to the story changes, the way in which you tell also changes slightly. So that way, even if you are repeating it again and again, you shouldn't be too worried in a business context, as long as the objective for which you are doing that story is very, very clear. So many times people ask me this question, so what is the return on investment? Okay, because that's the most powerful question in a business setting, right?
Yeah.
So when I do a business story, so what's my return on investment? Okay, so there are people who have done experiments, and I mean, I'm going to give you two examples on the ROI of storytelling, and this is something that I read in this book called Stories at Work by Indranil Chakrabarti. And in that, there's one instance is this. In 2016, Huffington Post carried a story of an young man who sold his 1997 manufactured Opel Tigra car. Okay, and he wanted to sell it on eBay. His post was accompanied by a long story about his girlfriend becoming pregnant, his encounter with the police when he was 18, his relationship with his father, and finally about his friend who advised him to sell his car to a hobby car enthusiast, as it was neither new nor any good. The cars of his vintage and use were selling it around 2,000 euros on eBay. Whereas this auction, the auction of this car on eBay, stopped at 55,000 euros. That's a whopping increase of 53,000 euros because of a 3,200 worded story. So what is the ROI of this story? The ROI is 17 euros per word. So that's how powerful a story can be. Okay. And in another instance, there are two American authors, Rob Walker and Joshua Glenn. They designed a curious experiment. Okay. They bought some cheap stuff like cork bottles, birthday candles, paper fans, pencil cases, paperweights, napkin rings, etc., and from garage sales and thrift sales shops. Okay, and they then ask some creative writers to come up with stories about each of these objects, and then they put up the stories along with the objects on eBay to see if the stories enhance their value. They definitely did, because they bought all of these objects for $128 together and sold them for $3,612. That's an increase of 28.06 times. So that book, it says, the ROI of storytelling is either 28.06 times or 17 euros per word. So these are just two examples that I can give, okay, in terms of what is ROI storytelling. But stories actually get across your message, right? So whether be it in a sales context or a marketing context, or you are trying to engage your existing customers, or you're trying to get more business out of your existing customer. So in all of these cases, stories really work because it allows you to communicate what you have done for similar customers in their domain, right? So that's where it comes into play. But how do you tell this as a story? Okay. See, for instance, when you present your story, you'll have to present it as if you're talking to a single individual. It should not appear as if you're addressing a meeting full of people. Instead, it should be said in such a way that you are addressing a single individual. Your story is the bait, right? So always look for a better bait. Because if your story, I mean, if people don't feel towards your stories, then you look for a better bite, you look for a better story. So you'll have to keep improving your story game there, okay? And it has to be authentically true and not just factually correct, okay? So I'll give you the difference between authentic and factual with an example, okay? So when I say 700 happy passengers reached the shores of New York after Titanic's maiden voyage, it's a factually correct statement. But is it authentically true? People will not trust you, okay, the moment you say this, because there are more people who died in that voyage than the ones who actually reached the shores of New York. So it has to be very, very authentically true. And then you use personal stories that you draw from your own experiences. Okay, so for instance, I mean, dopamine is a chemical, right, in your brain that chases rewards. Okay, for the rich, it would be Rolex watches and BMW 7 Series and Mercedes Benz. For the poor, it would be food, drugs, and sex. And for someone who really wants to communicate well to the audience and make their communication stick, it has to be in the form of a story. Okay. So happy storytelling.
In a corporate setting, apart from sales function, what are other functions where you can use storytelling?
Initially, right? So when you look at communication itself, okay,
Yeah.
so it was all focused towards, I mean, I'm talking about 2-3 decades ago, it was all focused towards the external world.
Okay.
All communication was external communication. So then it became, then, I mean, in the last decade or 1.5 decades ago, people started looking at internal communication also. Okay, so you have external stakeholders, you have internal stakeholders. So you started addressing everybody. So when you talk about storytelling, it is equally applicable for the external world, which is your customers, which will be done by your sales marketing function, as well as for your internal communication. It will be done by your project management, product management, HR. So in fact, across the organization, you can use stories.
Yes, sir. Okay. So what is the percentage of organization has realized the importance of storytelling?
I actually don't have a number here, okay, but
Approximately, I mean.
all that I can say is, I mean, it's minuscule in nature at this point in time. However, people have understood the importance of it. There are organizations, I mean, World Bank has got a chief storytelling officer today.
Okay.
Okay. Microsoft has got a chief storytelling officer. Nike has got a chief storytelling officer. SAP has got a chief storytelling officer. So a lot of multinationals have understood the importance of storytelling, and they have a function that is called chief storytelling officer. I mean, just in jest. Okay, so now with all this pandemic and people having, I mean, people doing remote work, so now there is a new designation that has come up, which is called head of remote working. Okay, so in fact, Facebook has released an advertisement seeking a person for the role of head of remote working. So people have started to understand, you know, as things start demanding, they have understood that there is a need for organizations to communicate effectively. There is a need for organizations to reach their communication out to the audience that they are going after. So storytelling is becoming mainstream. So I'm sure in another 4-5 years, most organizations would have it. I mean, closer home, Wipro sends its top management to Jaipur Literature Festival every year to learn the art of storytelling. Okay, so they undergo workshops there to learn how to tell stories. So it's happening.
Is it advisable to have a storyteller as a part of internal team, or you can hire an external consultant for the purpose?
It works both ways, but everybody in an organization has to tell stories if they want to communicate effectively, right? So the external consultants may not be able to help you a lot, okay, because whatever help that they can do is in putting together for point projects and in a piecemeal manner. See, for instance, if you're pitching to a customer, yes, an external customer consultant can come in and help. But if you're talking about internal communication, then it has to be in the DNA of the organization itself. So to begin with, you can start with an external consultant and then slowly have to grow that as a practice within the organization. So it's like saying, you know, can I outsource marketing to an external agent? I mean, you do that. I mean, a lot of companies do it, but after a point in time, they realize, you know, I have to keep my marketing in-house because it's a daily basis. I'll have to keep doing some hustle around marketing, right? So that is the same with the communication as well. See, I mean, even with communication, a lot of people work with multiple agencies. So you can have a combination of consultant as well as the internal resources.
Any final comments, sir?
Stories are the best way to reach out to your audience. And if you don't remember anything at all from this talk, at least take this as a message, the test of 3, which is, can you make your audience understand what you're talking? Can you make sure that they remember what is being spoken? Can you make sure that they can retell what they have heard from you? So as long as you make sure that all of your communication sticks to this test of 3, then you're doing a good job, whether or not you use stories.
One final question, sir. I missed it out. How do you take care that storytelling does not lead to exaggeration?
Right. So that's where you don't do made up stories, right? So the moment you make up stories, then it might lead into exaggeration. And plus, in a corporate setting, as I was telling you, you should keep your stories to say between 2 and 3 minutes, not more than that. Okay. So within 3 minutes, the chances that you would exaggerate would be very, very limited. Okay, so it's more like, you know, if you look at it, I mean, who are the best communicators that you have come across? I would say stand-up comics, right? Their set is like so tightly done. Okay, so if they are given 3 minutes, they know that they have to elicit at least 6 laughters in 3 minutes, and then it starts with it ends with the biggest laughter, and the second biggest laughter is the beginning. Okay, so that's how they do a set, and then they always follow something called the rule of 3. Okay, so everything is done in 3, right? Point number 1, point number 2, and point number 3. So their set is like pretty tight. So something similar to that is what you have to do, so that you achieve your objectives, and at the same time, audience feel that okay, they are emotionally invested in what you are talking.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot for spending your valuable time, sharing your experience and knowledge. It was a great pleasure interacting with you, sir.
Thank you so much, Suresh, for having me.
Thank you, sir.